Hello everyone, thank you for braving the frogs and the fascism and skipping Pat's presentation about a popular system that everyone loves to hear about the unpopular systems that very few people love. Oh, I actually just kind of spoiled my gimmick. Well, that's okay. Let's get going. So this presentation, 40 years of the NES. NES is 40 years old today. The system shipped in, or appeared first in New York City, October 15th, 1985. So making today literally the 40th anniversary. It single-handedly saved video games forever. Let's recap history. So in the beginning, Atari created video games. But then Atari, they got greedy and they made bad video games, like E.T. And that Pac-Man, what's happening there? Look at that. Terrible. These games were so bad that everyone said, you know what, we actually hate video games and we're never going to buy them again. But luckily, Nintendo came along and created the NES and made people realize, this egg guy, he's amazing. He's a robot in an egg that's a TV. Look at that, an epiphany.
To see, to touch, to play with Rob, the extraordinary video robot.
So people went and they touched Rob, the amazing video robot, and video games were saved. Thank you, Nintendo. Thanks everyone for coming to my presentation. A true and accurate history of video games. Nintendo saved everything. No. This presentation is 40 years of not the NES. It's about all the systems that were out there that sold collectively about 10% of what the NES sold back in the late 80s. But there were tens of millions of people who owned an NES. And that means there were millions of people who owned these systems. These games, these systems, they're legitimate. They have meaning to a lot of people, and they tend to be swept under the rug with people, celebrating the more popular system. NES was just, we talked about this on a recent episode of Retronauts, I think, about why the NES took hold and became so prevalent. And a lot of it had to do with timing of things like the generation that grew up playing NES games was also there kind of at the forefront of emulation. So when people started preserving games through emulation and making those available in the late 90s, early 2000s, NES was their big focus because that's what they knew, because the system was so interesting. It's like kind of easy to program for, but also very complicated. So it was challenging, but provided like a steady baseline. So just for a lot of reasons, also Nintendo has been very, very good about maintaining nostalgia and feeding that. And unlike all of these companies, Nintendo is still a first-party hardware maker. So it has kind of this baked-in audience and history to it. So, NES, for a lot of reasons, has become kind of the touchstone of 8-bit nostalgia. But again, it's not the only system that was out there. So let's look at history from a more accurate perspective. Of course, Atari popularized, not invented video games in the early 70s, 1972 with Pong in arcades, and then 1975 with Pong at home. Almost exactly the same thing. And after a couple of years and lots of success, they said, we would like to launch a programmable console like Magnavox's Odyssey and Fairchild's Channel F, one that you can stick cartridges into and change what it does, so everything is not hardwired. So people have an option to play something other than Pong or Snoopy Pong or whatever. The problem is that consoles, engineering these things, it's actually very expensive. It takes a lot of money. I don't know if you know that, but from what I've heard, inventing a console and then manufacturing it and selling it takes some money. Luckily for Atari, a little company called Warner Communications stepped in and bought them. And Warner was a massive media conglomerate. They had a lot of money, and that money helped make Atari's dreams a reality. It also helped that Atari built a strategic partnership with Sears. And back in the 70s, there were a lot of regulations from the Federal Communications Commission that really made things complicated for people putting out hardware in the US. Lots of limitations and things like that. Sears, had their own line of televisions and electronics, so they helped Atari navigate FCC approvals and help them fast-track their console into the market ahead of a lot of competing systems that were rushing to the market at the same time, like the Odyssey 2. And voila, You have the video computer system, or the 2600, or actually this is the Sears version, which is identical, but Sears did their own branded version of all the games. That's actually, I believe, Breakout, but they called it Breakaway 4 for some reason. So, you know, it was the 70s. People, it was wild. The thing is, though, Warner Communications had a very buttoned-up corporate culture, and Atari did not. Atari was a ragtag company where, you know, guys like Steve Jobs could hang out in the warehouse and smoke pot and go without showering for a month or so, and that was just the way it was. That was just how Atari rolled, and, you know, the results speak for themselves. They made so many cool video games, but Warner came in and said, maybe don't do that so much. So it really put the kibosh on the corporate culture at Atari, and, you know, like a lot of big companies, Warner didn't really appreciate the creative people who were actually creating and inventing and coming up and programming the games for them. And they said, these are just products that we can put out. You humans are interchangeable. And the creatives said, actually, no, we are the ones who are making billions of dollars for you, so let's go make billions of dollars for ourselves. So they decided to go launch their own independent, creator-focused company and came up with a company that I think is synonymous for independence and support for creatives, Activision. Yeah, you know, things change. But Activision in the beginning was great. They made really cool games, and they did it without Atari's permission. They made games for the 2600, sold them, and Atari said, whoa, no, you can't do that because this is our console, this is our system. You're using knowledge that you learned while you worked here at Atari. And the court said, actually, no, they can do that. And so Activision was A-okay, they could keep making games, but a lot of other people realized, oh, we can also do that. And so lots of people suddenly started making Atari games without Atari's permission. And unfortunately, most of them were not great. They were not up to Activision standards for the most part. So that led to the 1980s video games crash. Why did it happen? Because too many people were making games, and not enough people were actually testing to make sure those games were good. And consumers noticed. One, there were so many games out there that everyone had enough. They didn't need to buy any more games. And also, the games they did buy were often really crummy, and there was no real way to test. You couldn't, like, download a demo back in 1982. So, you know, at the same time, there was a recession going on, and people had to cut back on spending. All of this led to retailers being stuck with tons of cartridges that they couldn't sell. And, you know, they bought these cartridges at, you know, wholesale prices and then had to dump them for half of wholesale price or less. So they lost money on these things. And they said, you know what, let's not do video games anymore. Lots of publishers went out of business and lots of retailers lost money, you know, on top of a recession, which is bad. You don't want to lose money anytime, but especially during a recession. So if you look at the stats, more than 300 games were released on consoles in 1983 across all the consoles active in the US market at the time. That's not computers, that's not international markets, that's just American console games. In 1985, how many console games do you think shipped to retailers brand new in 1985? Throw out some numbers, anyone?
301.
301? You're wrong. You're extremely wrong. Think the other direction.
65.
Okay, some of you are a little low, but not too low. Between January and October.
20.
Okay, pretty good. You were a little generous, but you know, Price is Right, you'd still lose because you went over. 18 console games were released for mostly ColecoVision, just leftover stuff between January and October of 1985. So when Nintendo launched the NES in New York City, even though that was a limited market, they literally doubled the number of new console releases for the year in 1985 with that one release, 17 games. Okay, so they came just a little short of doubling, but close enough. They would win on Price is Right because that's less than 18. So publications at the time were lamenting. Okay, there was one publication at the time, the Computer Entertainer Newsletter. Everything else focused on video games in America had folded. This little newsletter printed in like Van Nuys, how you pronounce that. They were sad about how hard it was to get new console games, and when rumors started percolating of Nintendo launching a new system, they were, as our friends in Britain would say, chuffed. Absolutely chucked. So if you go back and read the Computer Entertainer Archives, which have been made public domain by our friends at the Video Game History Foundation, it's a great read around this time because you really can get a sense of the fact that home video games went off a cliff, just wiped out, and there were people holding out hope, lots of plans and announcements that didn't really resolve in anything. And Nintendo created huge buzz. And they did it with moxie. They had pluck. They overcame retailer skepticism. Retailers were like, we do not want new video games. Please go away. And they said, what if we gave you a bunch of video games that you can sell, and anything you don't sell, we'll buy back. And retailers said, okay, now you're talking our language. And then that worked out. So then they rolled out nationwide the following year with the help of Worlds of Wonder, the Teddy Ruxpin people who were, had knowledge about electronic toys and said, these Nintendo kids, they've got something here. We're going to help them get this into the market, and we're going to make a lot of money off of it. And they were right. So Nintendo did jumpstart the moribund US console industry, but they weren't alone. The games were out there. The FBI agents were hunting for them. Spooky music. Alex Kidd, very spooky. So what we're going to talk about for the next half hour or so is what else was out there, and what did it mean? What was significant about it, and what was good about it? Why should you go out and hunt for these things that are not the NES? Because there's some good stuff out there that I think everyone should play. So we're going to start with Atari Corp. This is not the same as Atari Inc. Atari Inc. was the company that Warner bought, and then bad things happened. They never really went away, but in 1983-84, Warner sold Atari for parts. And there were two parts specifically. There was Atari Games, the spin-off that kept making the arcade games, and they kind of went through some turbulence. Namco initially acquired them, but then sort of divested themselves, and from what I understand, a collective of former Atari employees, their arcade people, bought the company back and sort of created Atari Games that way. This is not relevant to this discussion because we're looking at the early NES era. And Atari Games didn't enter the picture until they formed Tengen and tried to do an Activision to the NES. So that's a different story for another time. But then the second part is Atari Corp, the spinoff that kept the consumer products. That's consoles and computers. They were acquired by Jack Tramiel, who had founded Commodore and was then ousted from Commodore, but still wanted to be in the computer biz. And he saw with Atari's fire sale the opportunity to get back into the business and also get back at the company that had sort of pushed him out. So he bought Atari Inc.'s home division, called it Atari Corp, and used that basically the engineering knowledge, the talent there, the resources to fast track a new computer called the Atari ST, which he launched as a competitor to Commodore's new Amiga system. And they put that system together from like conception to launch in 9 months, which is absolutely crazy. I think Jack Tramiel is a pretty controversial figure, but in this sense, he was a true mad lad. He went to the mats and he did it. He made it happen. However, he also did not like consoles and video gaming in general. But as it happened, Atari Corp owned a whole bunch of inventory of consoles and games because of the acquisition. So this was free money that was literally just sitting there. Actually, it was losing them money. It was opportunity cost. They had to pay warehousing on this stuff. So at some point, once the ST was out the door, he said, we might as well do some video game stuff. And therefore, Atari 2600 came back.
As you can see, with the 2600 from Atari, $250 away there, come on. It's a time of the game at the radio store. Watching the action drop, and you're gonna make it, you got to be tough. You're gonna pass it, it's arcade blast. You're always, you got to be fast.
Yes. So the thing is, the fun never left, actually. It's true that it wasn't until the fun was back that someone made a rap about Midnight Magic. But the fun never actually left. It was always there. It was millions of people still owned Ataris. It's not like E.T. and Pac-Man came out and everyone threw their 2600s in the garbage. They had them. Maybe they weren't buying new games for them, But there was a launch base. Not only that, but Atari had a manufacturing pipeline. They had inventory of systems, they had inventory of games, and they had a means to make them easily. And so they realized that not everyone could afford a new Nintendo system, which retailed for $100 or $129, whichever model you got. The cartridges started out selling for about $25, and they quickly climbed in price up to 30, then 40, and eventually up to 50 or 60 toward the end when they were, had all that extra stuff in them. So Tramiel saw an opportunity. Let's make the 2600 the starter system. For everyone who can't afford an NES or whose parents don't want to spend that much money on a system, they can get the 2600. A $49 console with new games selling for $10. That's quite a deal. And as a result, the 2600 found new life, and millions of systems sold, millions of games sold. Atari shipped several dozen, as well as some third parties, shipped several dozen games for the 2600 after the NES launch. And not only that, but some of these are the best 2600 games ever made. People tend to overlook the late 80s stuff on the 2600, but there's some great games, like genuinely fun stuff to play now. Very impressive. So we're gonna take a couple of minutes to go through the noteworthy games of the latter 2600 era, starting with Solaris. Now, it's a little confusing to look at here because it's one of those things where you have to kind of play it to have the context for it. But it's very visually impressive. This was made by Don Newart, the creator of Star Raiders. And this actually started out kind of as a Star Raiders follow-up and also kind of as a movie adaptation for The Last Starfighter. And all of that fell through, but he said, I'm going to finish this game. And he did. And so it is more like a consoleized version with a more intense action focus of Star Raiders, which is very impressive. That was cutting edge. When that came to the computer in 1979, 1980, Star Raiders was like mind-blowing. It changed everything about video games. And getting that onto a hoary old piece of hardware like the 2600 was very impressive. So it was quite an accomplishment, a great game. It's still really cool, really impressive to look at, and it does things with the 2600 hardware that you couldn't have done with the NES. Like the NES didn't have the ability to draw directly to screen like this because of its tile-based graphics system. So you were getting effects that you wouldn't see on the NES. It holds up, I think, really well to contemporary NES releases, which are like, Clu Clu Land. Another noteworthy early kind of revitalized Atari game is Junior Pac-Man. Now Pac-Man for 2600 is sort of famous for being horrible. And there are a lot of complicated reasons for that. But Junior Pac-Man for 2600 feels like sort of an apology for that. They used a bigger ROM chip for it, took more time to program it, and they did change how the arcade game works. Normally, like in the arcade game, it scrolls horizontally. Here it scrolls vertically. But it plays really smoothly. It has all the right stuff in it, if you take too long to gobble dots, they start getting bigger, and if you eat the bigger dots, it slows Junior down. So there's a lot of strategy to it, a lot of just great, interesting stuff about this game. It's a real standout on the system. Skateboarding by none other than David Crane, the inventor of Pitfall, the Activision guy. That's right. After Activision, he went to Absolute Entertainment, which got its name because it's one higher in the alphabet, the directories, than Activision. Later, you would get to Acclaim, and then I think eventually someone created a software company called and you don't get ahead of that. But skateboarding, this game is wild because it is an open world game about riding around on a skateboard, performing tricks. You have to find all the tricks in the world and perform them in as little time as possible. It's basically Tony Hawk Pro Skater more than a decade before Tony Hawk Pro Skater. I mean, it doesn't have the soundtrack, but the fact that David Crane did this, he was like, what'd be really cool is just to putter around a skate park. Like really kind of early in the skateboarding trend, like when that mania sort of first took hold. Very, very groundbreaking game design, very on trend for the moment. On the 2600, nowhere else. There was a sequel on 7800 called Super Skateboarding, but it's not the same. It's like a side-scroller, almost like a Metroidvania, where you have to turn off electric buzzsaws and lights and stuff in a building. It's weird. Another one is River Raid 2, which is... Oh, that's really loud. Hang on a Wow, we are under attack. River Raid 2 was not made by, oh, I totally forgot her name, the original designer of River Raid, but it's an impressive showcase of what the 2600 could do, what is that, a vertical scroller, yes, where you run around and the scenery is generated dynamically, just a, an important follow-up to one of the most important games on the 2600. And finally, I want to call out Secret Quest, which made a big deal of the fact that it was supposedly designed by Nolan Bushnell. I don't know if it actually was. I don't know if Nolan Bushnell ever actually designed games, but Atari went out and found, their guy, Nolan Bushnell, and said, hey, would you put your photo on this box for us and your name? And he said, okay. But this is kind of a cool game. It's sort of the 2600's version of The Legend of Zelda, and it's more concrete and coherent and less confusing and puzzle-like than the Sword Quest games. So it feels very much like an attempt to kind of meet Nintendo at what they were doing, obviously within the limitations of the 2600. But all of these games that I've just gone through, they're not the only good games on 2600 in the latter days, but they're really good, and they really show that the 2600 was appealing, continued to appeal to developers and designers who really, thought in terms of what can we do to push this hardware, and to continue to be in conversation with the evolving nature of home game design. So 2600, not everything was a winner. This is Double Dragon. God bless them for trying. It's just, not the best idea. There were some misses for sure, but they were trying. And if you couldn't afford an NES, you could afford Double Dragon, so you got to play something roughly approximating the Double Dragon experience, which one could argue the NES version of Double Dragon was also roughly approximating the Double Dragon experience. So, in the end, wasn't this just as good as the NES game? All right, so that's the 2600, but that was not all that Atari had up its sleeve. No, because back in 1984, they were going to launch the sequel to the 2600, a backward-compatible machine called the 7800, which was going to bring the, basically leapfrog the Intellivision and the ColecoVision and bring the Atari experience into the, screaming into the modern era. But unfortunately, 1984 is when Warner said, beat it, kid, and got rid of Atari, and so this did not happen. So I think, from what I understand, they got as far as manufacturing all this hardware and a bunch of games, and then they sat in a warehouse for 2 years. So Tramiel said, you know what, we have the opportunity to have sort of an elevated version of the 2600 here with the 7800. We have a mid-market option. NES is for the rich kids, Atari 2600 is for the people on a budget, but if you have a little bit more budget, you can go with the 7800 and you can have yourself a pretty cutting-edge experience by 1984 standards. This was 1986, so time had marched forward a little. Game technology evolved more quickly in the 80s than it does now. But the promise was it's pricier than the 2600, but cheaper than the NES. However, you can play 2600 games on this. So you can buy this, and then you have access to both libraries, 7800 and 2600. And the rollout for the 7800 in May 1986, around the time the NES was going nationwide, was pretty fantastic. It had a bunch of games. They were slightly dated arcade conversions, but they were the best arcade versions, or home versions of those arcade games anyone had ever seen. Admittedly, they kind of cheated to get there. Because the 7800 was supposed to have launched a few years before, they had this huge pile of games just kind of waiting in warehouses for them to roll out. But the thing that made them so great was that the company that designed the 7800 hardware was also the company that programmed all of these games. So they knew the hardware inside and out from day one, and they took advantage of it. And these guys were no slouches. They were General Computer Corp, the people who designed Miss Pac-Man and made a bunch of other really great arcade games like Food Fight, which showed up early in the 7800's life. And they were responsible for almost everything in that first wave of 7800 games, and they were phenomenal. I mean, you remember Atari 2600 Pac-Man. Here is GCC's version of Ms. Pac-Man, which looks really good for a 1984 game. If this had actually made it out, it would have blown minds. Like, this was the best looking Pac-Man home adaptation anyone in America would have seen. And it stands to reason because GCC created Ms. Pac-Man, they created the 7800, and they created this version of Ms. Pac-Man. So they took the time to refine it, add new features, new options. It's a great, great conversion. And this was kind of the 7800 promise, like, here's great arcade games. In 1986, these were starting to look a little long in the tooth, but still, if you were, kind of still in that mindset and wanted these home conversions of these great games that you loved, 7800 was a compelling option. Unfortunately, once Atari burned through that banked material, they didn't really invest in new 7800 development for a while. So you had this great launch that kind of fizzled out. It trickled to nothing. And right around the time that the NES was really exploding in popularity, 1987, 88, where you had games like Metroid and Zelda and Super Mario Bros. 2, there just weren't that many things happening on 7800, and it lost any momentum that it would have had. There was very little internal support for it. Atari didn't do a lot of marketing for it. Third parties were slow to sign on. And, Atari did not reach out to other programmers and say, hey, why don't you guys jump on board this system the way that Nintendo did with NES? And there weren't really any cutting edge exclusives for the system. So the 7800 was kind of had its legs cut out from underneath it by its own creators, which is a shame because it's a great piece of hardware. Despite all of this, there were still a few games that I think really stand out and continue to be great, interesting, fun games. Speaking as someone who did not own a 7800 back in the day, who has discovered these in recent years, I had a great time with these games and some others, but I want to call these out. One is Desert Falcon, which is an original game that GCC programmed for 7800. They basically said, what if we made Zaxxon, but you were a bird and you were stealing the pharaoh's gems? I don't know why you're doing that, but it goes through a bunch of different stages. Atari converted this to a bunch of different platforms, but to me, the 7800 is the definitive platform. It's what they designed this game for. Ball Blazer is another great one. This was a Lucasfilm Games, developed game for Atari 8-bit computers, and the 7800 handled it with style and aplomb. Apparently no sound effects though. No, actually, that's a lie. This is one of the two 7800 games that had the Pokey chip added into it. The 7800 had the same sound hardware as the 2600, but developers could add a Pokey chip, the Atari arcade chip, and this had dynamically generated music. It's like this crazy rockin' soundtrack that's different every single time. I'm sorry that for some reason my video did not include it. Impossible Mission, a home conversion of a great computer game. Oh, sure, now we get the music for the sound for Impossible Mission. This was a really kind of revolutionary game that I don't think gets enough credit these days. It's kind of like the first action roguelike. Like the levels are procedurally generated and there are contests and challenges in each stage. It is possible in this version to get a locked game, a soft lock, and not be able to get your way through. But aside from that one little, it's not beatable thing, it's a great conversion. Another one, Dark Chambers. I can't remember the name of the designer on this game. Oh, that's too loud. All right, buddy. But this is basically Gauntlet. It's kind of funny that 7800, none of the Atari systems had a version of Gauntlet on them because that was an Atari game, but that was an Atari's game. This was Atari Corp. It's very political, it's very weird. This was created by the guy who made Dandy, which was the game that inspired Gauntlet in the first place. So this was kind of Atari's claim to authenticity. Like, oh, you guys have your Gauntlet on your NES, but we've got Gauntlet's, the follow-up to Gauntlet's inspiration. So we're legit. Anyway, very good game, very cool, fun to play, it's cooperative, I recommend it. It also showed up on other systems, but again, I feel like the 7800 version is kind of the one to get. So anyway, that's the Atari 7800. A great strategy, love what Atari is doing there, but oh no, what is this? The XE game system, Jack Tramiel, WTF, man. So, you have a three-pronged console strategy from Atari. You have budget, mid-market, and disaster. So this was a consoleized Atari XE65, an 8-bit computer. You may recall that the 5200 was basically a consoleized Atari 8-bit computer that couldn't play the 8-bit games, because of some minor hardware differences. Well, here we have the XE game system, which can run those Atari 8-bit computer games, but not the 5200 games. So it's not even compatible with Atari's own console. It's a mess. It launched in October 1987. This is when Atari should have been pushing the 7800 really hard to counter all those great Nintendo games, but they didn't. So they just really muddied the console market. It's a terrible choice. Like, I think this is a really cool system in some ways, but a huge disaster, a huge mistake. I mean, it's great that it had an instant library of tons of games for the 8-bit Atari system. You could expand it to be a full 8-bit computer system. I love those pastel buttons, they're cute. And it did give, people who owned an Atari 8-bit computer a little more time to use their system, because it did kind of stretch out the platform's life, but it made Atari's console strategy confusing to consumers. By competing with their own consoles, it did nothing to help the 7800, which is where Atari really should have put its eggs. But this was the basket that they decided to throw them into. And the 8-bit computer line was already on the way out thanks to the ST. People were moving into 16-bit computer technology at this point, so just a bad choice. Atari, you just had to blow it at the end. Now, there's another legacy corporation that was around, kind of, and their story is very similar to Atari's. That's INTV. Now, Mattel Intellivision debuted in 1975, and Mattel, the toy company, created Mattel Electronics to run it. That's great. Unfortunately, around the time that Warner said, get out of here to Atari, Mattel said, this is a bad idea, and they dumped their Mattel Electronics division, killed the Intellivision. But there was a marketing executive, Zaleski, who didn't think that video games were dead. He saw the crash as a lull, and he said there's still a place for entertainment like this in the home. People still want video games, and people still want Intellivision. So he managed to acquire the rights to Intellivision from Mattel and established a company called INTV Corp to revive the platform. And as a matter of fact, this was something that happened before Nintendo did its test launch. The very first new INTV releases, not older games that were still kind of in the pipeline and just trickled out into retail, but games that specifically INTV acquired and said, let's put these out there, debuted at the same time as the NES. So even if Nintendo hadn't launched the NES, there still would have been some new video games in October 1985. NES was not inevitable. Like, video games were going to come back. It's just Nintendo came up with a better game plan than INTV Corp. So INTV positioned the Intellivision as the ultra-budget alternative to the NES. So Intellivision, or Atari 2600 games cost $10. Intellivision games cost $5. I don't know how this was a money-making venture for them, but they ran a very lean, tight ship. Like, they didn't make a lot of money off games, and they didn't spend a lot of money on games. They started doing things like getting rid of the controller overlays and simplifying the game design so that you could just play without having to know what all those buttons at the bottom of the Intellivision dial pad did. And most of the games that they put out were tweaked reissues of existing games where they added like 2-player controls or something like that, or games that Mattel hadn't published because of the crash or because they were bug-ridden and said, I don't know about that. So INTV was like, what's a few bugs between friends, and put out some games that, they needed some debugging and they didn't get it. But, they were $5, so who's going to complain? And I will say that some of the best Intellivision games ever to ship for the system came out during the INTV years. One of them this was a holdover from the older days, Thunder Castle. It's an amazing looking game. It's got Night on Bald Mountain playing in the background that you can't really hear here, but it has these dynamically changing mazes as you run around and try to collect goblets and treasures and stuff and defeat dragons, and then you go through 3 different stages fighting wizards and things like that. It's very impressive looking. It's a really cool game, fun, challenging, just exactly the kind of experience that Intellivision could deliver that other systems couldn't necessarily do. Diner, this actually began life as a He-Man and the Masters of the Universe game, which was a Mattel property, but when INTV acquired the rights to all this software, they did not acquire the rights to He-Man. So they said, what if we made this a Burger Time sequel? So you get this kind of weird isometric Burger Time style game that's actually really fun. It's just, it had a weird road to kind of getting there. And this is exclusive to Intellivision. No other platform has had this Burger Time sequel. And finally, the most amazing game, one of the very final games for the Intellivision, Stadium Mud Buggies. This is a competitor to RC Pro-Am somehow. Like, that was the wizards at Rare saying, what can we do to make an isometric racing game on NES? This game has elevations and slopes and jumps, which even RC Pro-Am didn't have. This is more like, like Ivan Stewart's Off-Road. And this is on Intellivision, a 1979 console. It's crazy that they did this. God bless them. Ultimately, INTV's strategy didn't pan out so well. People noticed the hardware deficits. There weren't that many new original games. They didn't compare that well to the 7800, to the Master System, to the NES. So after a couple of years, they shifted to a mail-order only strategy. And then a couple of years after that, they just shut down the system. The last cartridges for Intellivision shipped right before Sega Genesis and TurboGrafx 16 came to America. So there's kind of like a spiritual handoff here, because Intellivision was the first true 16-bit system. So as this 16-bit system wound down, the others wound up, and the torch passed. So it's kind of nice. It's nice. It's a worthwhile legacy. Some things came out of the Intellivision's revival, like the establishment of Real-Time Associates, which became a major developer. They also gave us Blue Sky Rangers, which was a coalition of people who, or a company, of people who worked on Intellivision and said, we should document this. And it's, became the first, as far as I know, internal effort by actual developers who were there to document video game history that they were involved in, which is inspirational and foundational to the kind of work that I do. So, Intellivision, it was worth having around again. So we're down to just about 10 minutes, and we've got one more system to talk about, and this is kind of the big one. Sega. I even had to change the background because, it's a grip. So Sega Enterprises, as you may know, Sega launched its first console, the SG-1000, on the exact same day that the Nintendo's first console, the Famicom, launched in Japan, July 15th, 1983. So there was like a destiny happening right there. And that system did okay for itself. Oh, I have a typo there. Ultimately, it ended up being too far behind the technology curve to compete with Nintendo. It was basically ColecoVision, and the Famicom was a next-generation console, basically. So Nintendo upgraded it to the Mark III. There was the Sega SG-1000, the SG-1000 II, which had removable controllers, very important, and then the Mark III, which launched in Japan on the exact same day that the NES debuted in America. Again, it's this rivals destined by fate or whatever. So yes, today is also the 40th anniversary of the Sega Mark III confetti celebration. We know this here as the Master System, or if you bought the system at launch, the Sega System. It debuted in September 1986, just around the time that the NES was finally available in any store you could imagine in America. And Sega shipped it as the Sega System or as the Master System, which was just called Master System because it had extra stuff in it. It had a light gun, no robot. They said, forget that. It was a more powerful console than the NES, even though it used the same technology inside, the same processor as the SG-1000, which was a ColecoVision. It had a new graphics processor unit that made all kinds of things possible that you could not do on the NES. And it did feel like a half-generational leap above the NES. Its best-looking games are things you could not do on any other console before the Genesis or the TurboGrafx. I will say that the hard break that they made with the SG-1000 gave Sega something of a disadvantage at the American launch. The NES launched with the best games that had appeared on Famicom for 2.5 years. So Nintendo had a deep bench to pull from. Sega could have pulled SG-1000 games dating that far back, but they would not have fared well on the market here. They would not have looked good. They would not have put the Master System in a good light. I mean, if you've ever seen the SG-1000 version of Wonder Boy and compared that to Adventure Island or the Master System version of Wonder Boy, you can see why they just said, our history begins here with the Mark III. So they had to produce a bunch of new games to get out for the American market. They didn't have the existing library of backward compatible games that existed in Japan. And they had to rely on their own releases because they did not subscribe to the third-party model until like 1988. They continued to publish everything themselves on SG-1000, on Mark III, on Master System, and that stretched their resources really thin. It did have a great strength though, like the retail look, the grid here, and I think like Garamond or some other fancy-looking typeface was inspired by Apple's marketing at the time. The high power of the system meant it could make home renditions of current arcade games, and they would look great. The NES could give you a great-looking Galaga or Pac-Man, but the Master System could give you a great-looking Fantasy Zone or Space Harrier or Outrun. One of those games was something kids were clamoring to play in arcades in 1986, 87. The others were not. And also because they were so kind of desperate to get content onto the US market, they were more likely to bring their weird experimental stuff over. Like Sega made active shutter 3D glasses. Nintendo did too, but Nintendo did not bring those to the NES. They said those are staying in Japan. Sega was like, you know what? We got to get some stuff out there. Let's go. Mark Cerny, make a game for us, and he did. If you look at the Master System library, there's some great stuff on there. The games on the system were mind-blowing. To see this, on a demo for a console that you could take home with you in 1986, amazing. Like, this version of Hang-On is phenomenal. It looks better than any other racing game anyone had ever seen on a home system, period. Like, this was the pack-in for the system, and Sega chose wisely. It was a groundbreaking arcade game and an amazing home conversion of that same game. Fantasy Zone was actually created in arcades for more powerful hardware, the System 1, or was it System 16? Yeah, anyway. It was a System 16 game, but even though the Master System was more like a System 1, they still did a great job programming it. I think this is actually Fantasy Zone 2 here that I showed for some reason. But, really impressive. If you owned this, sure, it's cute and colorful, but it's a really challenging shooter, and it looked great, it played great, it sounded great. Their home version of Wonder Boy looked way better than the version that Hudson brought over as Adventure Island a year later. Sega already had, the original and the best. Zillion, this is basically Impossible Mission, the same game as on 7800, but with a new look. It had Opa Opa in it, which everyone loves. It was based on a cartoon. It had, 3 different characters you could play as once you rescued them. But fundamentally the same game, Japanese version. Same game as Impossible Mission. Very cool, very, kind of showed Sega borrowing from the best and doing interesting, good things. They had a great version of Shinobi. If you've ever played the NES version of Shinobi, you know what a not great version of Shinobi looks like. This version, it feels like they took some notes from Nintendo's game design here, like their aesthetic, and made a fantastic home port of a top-of-the-line arcade game on a system that couldn't quite handle it, but they adapted it to home hardware really effectively. And of course, do I even have to mention Phantasy Star, the creme de la creme of the Sega Master System, programmed by Yuji Naka, directed by Rieko Kodama. Like, this was all their heavy hitters taking the time to make a game that really showed what the Master System could do. You can kill Jawas, but you can also barter with them. Phantasy Star was like what you put out there to say, I'm so proud to own a Master System. So, those were the games that were out there that weren't the NES. The NES was okay too. But the other guys are important. Millions of kids played these games. You don't hear about them as much. People don't make as many YouTube videos about them because I can tell you from personal experience that when you make a video about Atari 2600 games from the late 80s, people do not click on that the way they do a Legend of Zelda video. But it's still worth documenting, still worth talking about, and most importantly, worth playing. There are ways to play these games legally and illegally. Please delete your ROMs within 24 hours. But ultimately, all of these games existed in conversation with each other. They were out there, people were playing them, people should still play them, And video game history is richer for everyone being out there, not just Nintendo, because there's, there's power in diversity. That's an important lesson for any age, but especially this one. And I think we can learn a lot from video game consoles of the 80s. And I will do a little bit of a sales pitch here. I recently published a series of books called the NES Era, which are big photographic representations of not just the NES, but all the other systems that shipped around the same time. And that was kind of the impetus for this talk, was putting together these books and saying what else was out there at the same time as the NES. Made me realize some of it was really great, and people need to start talking about it, start playing it. So even if you don't buy these books, and I hope you do, I hope you will play these games. But that's all I've got. Time is up. Thanks for coming here. Thanks for looking at things that aren't the NES. Enjoy the show, and consider buying my book.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and here are a few more videos for you to check out.